In this PowerPoint, we're going to talk about self-management strategies. Self-management doesn't fit in quite as well as some of the other alternative behavior strategies. In other words, it doesn't really serve to the same function as a challenging behavior, but I like to discuss it along with teaching alternative behaviors for a couple of reasons. One of them, it does involve an actual skill that you're teaching the student that she or he could use across different settings. Also, like other alternative behaviors, you have to consider the antecedent stimuli that should set the occasion for using the skill. In other words, you have to think about when do you want the student to use this skill, and how do you teach the student to recognize those natural cues and respond to them. Self-management is appropriate for a lot of students with special needs. I've used it really effectively with kids with cognitive disabilities. I've used it with a lot of students on the autism spectrum, and I've used it with students with emotional and behavioral disorders. I think one of the reasons it works so well with these different groups of students is there are many things they have in common in terms of what they need. Most students with special needs need some kind of schedules. They need a way that daily communication or daily expectations can be communicated to them. They need some kind of space to structure their work, help them stay on task. They need either written or pictorial directions or visual prompts to remember to stay focused on an assignment or a task, whatever the task is. And you can adapt all of these modifications to different levels. The same thing goes for self-monitoring. It can be done on many different levels to meet the needs of a huge variety of students. Like other skills that we teach students with special needs, self-monitoring has to be taught directly. When I've seen it used ineffectively in school settings, it's usually when kids have been just given a self-monitoring sheet or some paper, and then someone just gives them the instruction, here, mark down every time you talk out in class. That is not an effective way to implement self-management, and we'll talk about some of the reasons. I've been extremely successful with using it because I always teach students through a particular process that we're going to go through. There's a huge amount of research literature that shows it's effective with a huge variety of students. In addition to helping students stay on task or engaged, it's also a good strategy to help students maintain gains in one setting into another setting. For example, if we work on teaching a student to ask for help or to limit the number of questions that she asks in one class, we could teach the student to self-monitor and self-manage that behavior in the class where she's been successful, and then sequentially implement self-monitoring and self-management across different classes. And it's a way that we can carry over gains made in one setting into other settings, so it really facilitates generalization. I like to think of self-management as a process where you can begin to teach students to accept responsibility for their own behavior and their own learning. So some of the research says that it increases students' level of self-efficacy, or the ability to believe in their own success. I would agree with that based on what I've seen. It definitely helps students become more independent and less reliant on prompts and cues from others. There are a number of really important advantages to using self-management, and even though it does take some time to teach this to a student, I think it's time that's very well spent, because it definitely enables a teacher to use his or her instructional time more effectively. So it can reduce demands on the teacher, it increases students' on-task behavior, helps students be more independent, and it gives them a way to begin to regulate their own behavior. And I've seen changes in academic settings. Once students learn to self-manage, you can teach similar approaches to managing social or vocational settings. I think self-management is a very naturalistic kind of skill. In other words, it's a skill that you can teach students that will fit into any kind of context or situation in which they go. And it definitely will help students begin to manage their own behavior. I also think it's a way that you can bridge the gap between students being reliant on teachers and staff to prompt them and regulate their behavior for them, to them beginning to develop self-control. So it's an extremely important skill for many students to learn. There are 4 big components to self-management. The first one's goal setting, establishing some kind of goal. Then there's a process called self-monitoring. A number of people in schools that implement this are only familiar with the self-monitoring step, and that's the only step they implement. But what we're going to see is that's just one step that fits into a larger set of skills. There's a component called self-instruction, where a student learns a new behavior to use in the situation where the old behavior occurred, and goes through self-prompting or self-talk. Not all students can do this. I've been able to teach self-monitoring, for instance, to younger kids or students with more significant cognitive disabilities. And the self-instruction part wasn't something they can learn, but it certainly doesn't mean that students can't benefit from the self-monitoring component. And then finally, there's a self-reinforcement component. Like the self-instruction part, this may not be something that all students can do right away, but it's another important skill that you might want to develop in older students or individuals in vocational settings. So the first step, goal setting. You figure out where is the student's behavior now. So like all the other strategies we talked about, you have to have a very clear, measurable, observable behavior. You take some kind of baseline assessment. You determine where the student is presently. Then you determine where you want the student to be. I like to set up an initial goal that could be achievable within a relatively short period of time. For instance, maybe what could we hope to gain in 2 weeks or 3 weeks? And that's my beginning point. So, for instance, we have Andy, and he has a problem turning in homework. Right now, he turns in homework about once per week. So even though we would really like him to turn in homework every day, we decide that, along with Andy, if he turns in homework 2 times a week for the first week, that's a good goal to shoot for. So that would be some initial improvement, and it's not too much to expect. But by the second week, we want him to be up to 3 times, and then by the 5th week, by the 4th week, we'd like him to be up to 5 times. So we're going to incrementally increase what we require of Andy. This is a common feature of a lot of effective behavior change strategies. We start out where the student is, and then we incrementally increase the requirement gradually over time. So we're going to use a self-monitoring star chart with Andy. I like to use something if there's a particular topic that the student has an interest in. For example, first time I ever used self-monitoring was a little boy with Asperger's syndrome many years ago, and he was really involved in basketball. He loved to talk about basketball and watch basketball, and he was trying to learn to play basketball. So we made a self-monitoring start for him that had a basketball theme. There were individual basketballs that he marked, and then there was a big net at the top that represented the goal. So in the beginning, the teacher is going to monitor Andy's behavior using the chart and give him a lot of praise. And then use a reinforcement, maybe initially a daily reinforcer, and then a weekly reinforcer that's a bigger one that we might put in place as well. And then the idea might be that we fade away the daily reinforcer and then just have a weekly reinforcer. but we stick with the daily one at first. The self-monitoring phase of self-management is the most time-consuming one to teach, and it's the one that often gets omitted when people try to implement self-management in school settings. If we think of self-monitoring as being broken apart into two steps, self-assessment and self-recording. Self-assessment is when you teach the student to discriminate when his or her behavior has actually occurred or hasn't occurred. Video helps a lot here. What I'll do when I use self-management is I will get some video of the student. For example, I did a study a couple of years ago of a young elementary age student in math group. He was engaging in disruptive behavior and being really off task. So I did some video of him working on his math workbook, and then I sat down with him and we watched the video together. And I just started asking, okay, right now, are you working or not working? He said, well, I'm working. That's right, you're working because you're looking at your book, you're writing down answers. Then later on, I say, right now, are you working or not working? And then, he would be like off task or fiddling with paper or something. And then he would, the first times we did it, he said, oh, I'm working. And I said, well, no, you're not looking at your book. And you're messing around with some other things on your desk so that you're not working right now. So you get the student, the idea is you reinforce correctly labeling behavior without really trying to label it as being bad or good at this point. It's just, that's good, you're right, you're not working, you're off task. So I've done this with really young kids too, with first grade age kids on the autism spectrum engaging in self-stimulatory behavior. I'd sit down with them and then go through a video, and they're either, are you working or are you not working? Well, you're not working because you're flapping your hand back and forth. You can, once a student is correctly labeling his or her own behavior, by the way, another way to do it is just modeling without using video. You can just demonstrate different behavior and then have the student practice it, but video really speeds up the process, so I would really suggest you use video here. Once the student's correctly labeling his or her behavior, then you give them a way to record. So I usually use a really simple sheet, with columns, and then you can either base behavior on, if it's work completion, the simplest thing might be record the number of math problems you complete. If it's on-task behavior, then you need some kind of cueing system. And I usually use, there's a number of apps on an iPod Touch that I use. One of them is just called Timer. And you can set it to repeat loops, so like a 2-minute loop, and it would vibrate or make a little soft sound every 2 minutes, and then the student just records every 2 minutes, whether she or he is working or non-working. You can also do this with asking questions in class. If a kid's asking too many questions, let's say, you could have, I want you to record every time you ask a question. The goal there would be you want to ask so many questions or less, and you start out with a level where the student is, and then you very slowly start reducing that until it's more like what the rest of the students are doing. I've given you a couple of articles with some examples of different self-monitoring, so take a look at those. You can be really creative and come up with innovative ideas for students to self-monitor. Another important thing to remember is you only would implement self-monitoring of a skill that the student already has. For instance, if you're teaching a replacement behavior and you want the student to self-monitor when he or she uses it, be sure you teach the behavior first. Or if you're having a student, self-monitor number of math problems completed, be sure that the problem is that the student doesn't know how to do the operation that you're requiring. So self-monitoring it gets students to perform skills they already know how to do in the right situation or under the right circumstances. It doesn't teach the student new skills, though. Here's another example of Susan. She's a young lady that hums a lot. So humming's a self-stimulatory kind of behavior, in her case anyway. So the teacher has her put an X in a box every time she hums. And she reminds her, initially she might prompt her, and then she's got some plan for fading the prompts. So you could use any of the prompt fading strategies that we've discussed in class. You could use time delay, or you could use system of least prompts or most of least prompts. I've used self-management often with these kinds of behaviors. The time-consuming part with a behavior like this is teaching the student to recognize and be aware of when she or he's doing it. Self-instruction is another piece of self-management, and you usually will integrate this into the self-monitoring or self-recording part. So it's something that you teach the student to say to herself or himself at the time when they record a behavior. Sometimes it's really simple. It may be simply, am I working or not working? Well, no, I'm not working. So I need to start working. I need to work until the timer goes off. Or if you're teaching a student anger management skills, we're going to talk about those in an upcoming class, but the strategy might be the steps in an anger management process that you've taught. So it might be, stop what I'm doing, take some deep breaths, think about the consequences of what would happen if I engaged in some problem behavior. So it's infinite, So academic strategies work really well here. If you're teaching a student to monitor on-task behavior, you might have teach them a strategy for some kind of academic task, or sometimes it might be a skill related to social interactions. So basically any kind of skill that you're teaching, would it make sense to teach the student to say some steps covertly to herself or himself at the point when they self-monitor? Sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense. Often it does. But it can be really useful. This is something that you have to practice a lot with a student. It's not something that's going to happen automatically. And often you can do some visual cues to help. Another point, often when I'll suggest self-management, people get really concerned that they believe a student would lie or record incorrectly on a self-monitoring sheet. The really fascinating thing about self-monitoring is there's a lot of research that shows even if a student lies or records the wrong behavior, the process of self-monitoring has the same effect on their behavior. And this is because even though the kid is marking down, yes, I was on task, or no, I didn't engage in the behavior, they're still aware that they did. So self-monitoring makes students aware of their own behavior. I believe that's an important part of it. And it's just as effective either way. Now what you can also do is have some other way of spot checking. That way, if your student's really, misrepresenting things, you would know it, and you can compare data. And there's a lot of research that shows most students, if they're aware that somebody's checking on them, they tend not to misrecord that much. I like to get students involved in self-instruction components. Like an example I use, this little boy in the first grade with Asperger's syndrome. When the students were reading, he would start flipping the page back and forth. And it really interfered with him reading independently. So he came up with a thing he would say to himself if he self-monitored and he was flipping the page. And he would just think, I need to read and not flip. That was just something real simple. Sometimes it might involve kids, saying a couple of sentences to themselves. A good idea might be to have a student make their own video that would remind them, and then they could watch the video just before a situation where they might need to use the skill. The self-reinforcement part of self-monitoring, self-management, is something you might do with older students. When I work with really young kids, I usually leave the reinforcement in the hands of someone else, because kids might it's just sometimes too much to expect. But with older students, you'd have them evaluate their own behavior relative to some kind of standard, and then determine whether or not they earned a reinforcer, and then access reinforcers. So the reinforcer might be that they get some free time, or they get to listen to some music, or they get to pick an activity they want to use. Or with some students, it might simply be that they get some points on a point sheet that they're going to count towards a different reinforcer. So, it depends on the student how much you want to get into the self-reinforcement part. A study I did last year with some high school students, I did use self-reinforcement, and it worked really well. I have tried this with younger kids, and it didn't work that well. They would just access the reinforcer whether they earned it or not, and it just was easier to have them check in with someone else. So, how do you implement self-management? Let's go through the steps. First thing you need to do is identify the behavior that you want to self-manage and come up with some positive examples and some negative examples. So if the behavior is being on task, come up with some examples of what on task looks like. Come up with some examples of what being not on task looks like, or being off task. Talk to the student about why the behavior is important. This is going to depend on the student how much verbal explanation you get into. Sometimes video helps here. There was a young man on the autism spectrum a number of years ago. He was actually a student in my wife's classroom, and he would walk down the hallway and lift up his shirt and scratch his belly, and he had kind of a big belly, and the other kids would laugh at him, and he was totally unaware of this. And then we tried talking to him about it. He just would say things like, well, if my tummy itches, I'm going to scratch it. Why wouldn't I scratch myself? Well, I took some video of him coming down the hallway, and you could see his belly jiggling around, and then you saw the other kids laughing at him and pointing. And I showed this to him, and he was really upset by it. Had he not been upset by it, I might have tried something else, but it made him aware why that behavior was important. And then we started having him self-monitor. We taught him to be aware of when he was doing that and was not doing that. That was the most time-consuming part. So you have to practice the behavior, and you have to practice the student being able to recognize when it has and hasn't happened. The next thing you do is come up with a system. How is it going to work for the student to self-manage or self-record? So in other words, is it going to be based on some kind of time interval, like every minute, every 2 minutes, every 5 minutes, at the end of an activity? Or is it going to be based on situations that come up naturally, like homework? It would be every day at this time, do I turn in my homework, yes or no? You have to actually teach the system to the student. So I do a lot of role playing. I will model how it looks. I might use video, I might not. And then I involve the student. So it's a lot of modeling followed by guided practice followed by rehearsal. And you continue to teach this until the student can demonstrate independently that he or she's mastered whatever self-monitoring skill that you're using. So however your self-recording works, however your if you have the student comparing his or her behavior to some kind of criteria, can the student do that? So here's an example with Mark. He's a young boy on the autism spectrum, and he's in a kindergarten in his home school. He's got a number of disruptive behaviors, like being on task, clapping his hand, non-compliance, and yelling out. And we have a goal for him to develop, maintain, and generalize some appropriate behavior during instruction. So we're focusing on how we're supposed to act during instruction. Once we've decided on the behavior, like being on task, let's say, we've got to teach our student what that looks like. So I'd probably use video, I'd use modeling, and I'd have the student role play in some situations. I'm going to involve everyone who works with the student in recognizing when this behavior is happening so they can prompt the student to self-monitor. You also want to make sure that you're doing this in the context of a positive classroom environment. If you don't have clear expectations and you don't have really frequent reinforcement and all those other things, self-monitoring is probably not going to have much of a benefit in isolation. It's got to happen in a context of other good things that are going on. Some of the things you want to be sure you have going on. You want to be sure that you've got a positive classroom environment where there are consequences for problem behavior that are appropriate and natural. In other words, if kids are disruptive, what happens afterwards? Does it make sense? Is it a natural consequence? Do you have frequent reinforcement for positive behavior? Do you have a system in place to reinforce students? Do you teach things that are the appropriate level? Are you using effective instructional practices? Are you using effective strategies to teach appropriate behavior and decrease problem behaviors? If you've got those things in place, then you can set up self-monitoring to help you generalize some of those effects to other settings or to help you maintain those across time. So we might come up with a goal for Mark. Let's say he's yelling out during class, and we might decide that we want to decrease that behavior by 95%. Well, for a kid that young, I'm not going to say decrease it by 95%, but I'm going to translate that into a number of times. So I take the average of his baseline data, and I would look at a goal of, if I decreased this by 95%, how many times per activity would this be? So let's say it came to about once or twice. I would have a self-monitoring sheet that would show that every time you yell out, you mark off something. And if you marked everything off at the end of a period, then you're not going to be reinforced. So in other words, the goal is to have one left. So I might have to have different goals at different points in time. Remember the example earlier with the homework? If I wanted him to end up with yelling out twice or once or less, I might have to start out with, okay, if you yell out 6 times, and then you have one left, so I might have 7 symbols on his self-monitoring chart, and I teach him to mark one off every time a behavior occurs. And the idea is you still have one left by the end of the activity, then you get to trade that for a reinforcer or for some kind of conditioned reinforcer if he's working towards something more delayed. Depends on where he is in the program. So over time, I'm going to decrease the number of symbols he starts out with. So instead of starting out with 7, he might start out with 6, and then he starts out with 5, he starts out with 4, and finally he starts out with 3. And that means he can have 2 incidents and still have 1 left and earn the reinforcer. And I can decide if I want to take that all the way down to 2, that means you just have 1 shot, or just leave it at 3. It depends on what my goal was and what level of the behavior is going to be acceptable in that environment. The role of the teacher in self-monitoring is very intensive at the beginning because the skill has to be taught to the student. Depending on the type of classroom and the students involved, you might involve peers. If it's a behavior that's maintained by peer attention or challenging behavior, then ideally I'd like to involve peers in the intervention plan. Maybe if you could teach peers to reinforce the student in some way. Or if you have kids from general education who are serving as peer tutors, this is a good thing for them to do as well. Depending on the age of the student, you may be able to fade out your prompts completely. Or with younger kids like Mark, you may have to still prompt and set some things up. I have been successful sometimes with some fairly young kids being totally independent with just someone checking in with them at the beginning and the end of an activity. Then I've had other kids that I thought would be independent still need a lot of prompting. It depends on a lot of factors. Either way, you can certainly increase your students' independence using self-monitoring. So peers you may involve in some level. Parents sometimes can be involved if you want to implement some aspect of the plan at home. With something like homework, this would be extremely important to involve parents. Working on social skills and other factors, if parents are willing to be involved, you can get much better generalization if you're working on the skill at home. And self-monitoring sometimes can be a tool to help you do that. This is an example of some of the self-instruction that we might teach Mark. So once we teach him to record his behavior on some kind of system, then we might teach him things to say to himself. Like, what am I supposed to do? If I need help, I raise my hand and I wait quietly. Well, we're going to obviously have to role play that and teach him to do it. Did I do them correctly? If I need help, I'll raise my hand and I'll wait. Did I do a good job raising my hand? So in this case, we're teaching him to self-monitor hand raising. We might have him mark off when he uses it. Or does he talk without raising his hand? Then he might self-monitor that as well. So this is just another example of how we would teach him to monitor. If he spoke out without raising his hand, he would mark an X on his paper, and then there would be some self-instruction that he might use. When you model self-instruction, talk out loud as though you're talking to yourself or instructing yourself through the process. Then when you have the student imitate, have the student speak aloud as though they're talking to themselves. Then as they begin to learn the self-instruction, have them whisper it to themselves, and then finally just have them say it to themselves silently. So with some kids you can say, this is like when you're reading silently, only now we're just thinking this silently. Some kids, I will have them do this while they're reading words, or if kids are not readers, then I may have some symbols or some icons that would remind them of the self-instruction. And then I teach them to point at the self-instruction as they say it to themselves. A variation with this would be if you have a kid that would watch a video. You could have them watch the video and have the self-instruction on the video in the audio, and then over time you could have the audio faded out, and you could teach them to say the audio part to themselves, first aloud and then silently. So the video could be a cue to say it to yourself, and then finally you could fade the video out. There are a lot of different ways to teach this, so you adapt it to what works best for your learner. Another aspect is in a self-management is having a plan. What are you going to do when the student follows the procedure? What are you going to do when the student has an error or engages in the challenging behavior? And that's certainly going to happen. So decide, how are you going to reinforce the student? Are you going to use verbal praise and informal things, and then at the end of the period or task, count up, self-monitoring, how many what did the student meet the criteria, whatever that was, whether it's a behavior that you're decreasing or increasing. Are you going to teach the student to use self-instruction? Can you reinforce the student for self-correcting? I always like to notice if students correct themselves and try to point that out and reinforce it. Or in this case, we used peers to note if he was off task, and they would prompt him to look at his card. And at the end, in the beginning, the teacher would tally up how many times he had self-monitored and determine if he'd met the reinforcement goal. And then later on, we might teach him to do that himself. Before we have class next time, I'd like you to think of some students that you've worked with or that you're working with now, and how could you use self-monitoring or self-management to assist those students. We'll do some activities where we'll work through developing a self-management plan together with one of the students that you've been working with. So if we get in groups of 2 or 3, between the 2 of you, come up with one student, and then we'll go through the steps together and then share results. It's extremely useful strategy. It can result in students being more independent. Like a lot of things, it does take some investment of time up front. You have to teach this to students, but the payoff is enormous. Once students learn self-management, very often it's easy to teach them to use it in a different situation or different setting. And it's one of those skills that someone can use over the course of a lifetime. I mean, think about it. Most of us use some kind of self-management strategies to help us get things done or help us keep things organized.